So good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm really excited to do this talk. It's really something that came out of a conversation I had with people in my group at work in 2018. So I wanted to kind of open with that story. So it was 2018. I had just taken over the clinical trial group at Siemens Lab Diagnostics, where I work. And I took out some of my staff who had been working there for a long time, and so over lunch we were talking, and I mentioned an article that was in the New York Times about how there's no genetic basis for race. And immediately I had a couple of my scientists start arguing with me. And I was just kind of blown away that, I have a very diverse group. So I had both Black people and white people looking at me saying, well, that's not true, but there's this and there's this and there's this. And I'm like, but none of that is true, and we know that now. But it made me think about how, even people, and these were all people I think who had bachelor's degrees, so they might not have kind of kept up with all the latest information, but it just made me understand that, people don't really know that. So they make a lot of assumptions still, and how hardwired that assumption is in our culture, that even when we have ample evidence to prove that that's not the case, people either don't know or don't want to believe it. So that's really part of why I was thinking I'd like to do this, and I wanted to do it in the month that we celebrate Juneteenth, because I think that's important information for folks to have. So I'm going to talk about first, through some issues that I have, experienced at work. This is a big discussion over the past couple of years in clinical trials. Do clinical trials reflect everybody we have in the community, right? And it's been very interesting. And part of it started, in 2005, there was an FDA approval for a drug that was geared to, cardiovascular health. And the company did a clinical trial with only people who self-identified as African Americans, and they actually got a patent and an FDA approval for a medicine to be used only in that group of people. And it was very controversial, and everybody, started jumping in saying, well, how do you know everybody was really African American if they self-identified? And there's a long history behind people who self-identify in medical studies. Just in general, it's not very accurate. So this thing kind of unraveled, and people were able to show that it's not just in African American people or people who self-identify as African American, that part of the reason African Americans or people of color in the United States have higher cardiovascular disease is really much more related to socioeconomic issues than to any underlying genetic basis. So, but that has spawned a lot of talk in clinical trials for, again, making sure we're including all different kinds of people in a trial. And it's been very hard, because at first the FDA said, all right, anybody doing a clinical trial, you have to show us that you have, ethnicity and race and all of these kind of diversity measures, even though it's really hard to describe what they are scientifically. And a trouble with that is, while you can put those laws and force clinical trials to do that, the problem isn't really the clinical trial. It's, the way we do a clinical trial is we go out and we interact with physicians who are treating patients. And so if a group of people isn't getting adequate care, which is kind of the situation for people of color in our communities, then they don't even get to the point where they get registered in a clinical trial. So there's been a lot of talk about that. And that was, kind of the most recent issue that brought a lot of this forward and has everybody talking about it. One of the really interesting things here was the company, part of their rationale was to point it toward only one racial community to make it patentable. So very interesting. So to just cut to the chase, we know that race is not biological, and we know that because we have ample evidence that racial categories were made up by us, just like ethnic categories. Humans made them up. humans make up all kinds of groups. That's kind of, a thing of human behavior, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. And also, racial definitions are changed depending on where you are. So what we think of as racial groups, Australians might not think of as the same racial groups, and Europeans might not think of the same racial groups, and Africans might not think. So it really changes depending on the context that you're in. There's no genetic differences that could describe a racial population, and that's what I'll spend a lot of time talking about today. And then, the reason for that, the reason you can't group a human into a genetic specific place is because of a lot of different effects that have happened to us as we've undergone evolution, and I'll talk a little bit about them. So natural selection, genetic drift, and gene flow. So all of that has kind of, it's very interesting, made us more alike than less alike. So a thing that greatly facilitated our information on this, right? So there was lots of fossil evidence about the evolution of humans, but one thing that really kind of broke it open was in the late 1990s and in the early 2000s, the Human Genome Project successfully sequenced for the first time the entire human genome, and of several people. And now there's hundreds of thousands of genomes available for study. So one of the first things we wanted to do is look across humans and find out how related we are. So I have a little quiz here that says, asks how related are humans, and 80, 85, 75, down to 50. Does anybody know what the answer is?
It's C.
Yeah, it is. So we are 99.9% similar.
Renee, what's the similarity? I mean, isn't the often comparison was like humans and chimpanzees, or it's
very
like
close
90%?
98%.
Wow.
So yeah, that's it's incredibly close. And I don't know about you guys, but when I go to the zoo, I feel that. So how, why? How do we know that? So part of what you have to really think about when you think about this stuff is the fact that our genome is 3 billion nucleotides long. That's a lot. And that's a lot of information packed in there. And so even though it's just a 0.1% difference, that's, translates into millions of differences that could be between any one of us. But what we've seen is like, everybody doesn't have like 99.9% of their gene the same, and then we just have a difference in 0.1. It's all along that 3 billion that we have differences. But the differences are situated in a way where, any two individuals are more different than any group. So you can't group people into genetic definitions. And there's, it's just as likely that Omira and I are as closely related as Nicole and I might be. Yeah. So
I think you and I are closer
but we can use that, some changes along the genome to trace your ancestry. But that's a very different, but tracing your ancestry doesn't define exactly who you are. So we'll talk about that in a little bit too. So for a long time, we've known that all humans share a common ancestry, right? The fossil record proved this very early, that humanity started in Africa, and in particular, East Africa. And from there, humans just migrated out. Sometimes they migrated back in. We have a much more sophisticated picture of human migration now, but it started in Africa, went to India, to Asia, and then over to North America. We used to think it was only by land bridge, but now there's some evidence that people were sailing around. And that's, partially could explain how they got to North America as well. The other thing that then substantiated this was genetics. And when people were sampled from all around the world, we got a much more complex pattern, but that pattern of moving from East Africa out through to North America still stands, although there was a lot more coming back and going out than we originally thought. So one of the strongest studies that was done used 650,000 genetic markers in 1,000 individuals from 51 populations across the globe. And I think the thing people don't realize is that if you want to find people with the greatest differences from each other, those are Africans. So people who are out of Africa have less difference. So people in North America have less differences than, two people in Africa would. And that's because Africans have been around the longest. So they've had the time to build up, more changes in their genome. But I think sometimes we think that, as you moved out to North America, you got more diverse, but that's not really what happened. So we'll talk a little bit about that too. Yeah, and one of the reasons that happens is each time you have a migration, it's a small group of people that go out, right? So you don't get the whole force of the genetic diversity from one migration to another. It's just a small population, and then stuff happens, which sometimes makes it even smaller. So one of these things that happens is called the founder effect. And you can see in that circle where there's, pink and purple, in the parent population, and then a small group migrates out. And then after a couple generations, they tend to be less diverse. A good example of this, and it can be really seen when a population gets isolated, which is not very common in humanity. We've mixed around and keep moving around. But in Amish population in Pennsylvania, that was a small group that came from Europe to the United States and live in a very, sequestered, isolated community. And so you'll see some genes like polydactyly, which is where you have extra fingers or toes, very prevalent in that population. Right. So there's nothing, in that case, there's nothing to really select against it. So it perpetuates.
Why is that? Why in that group?
Because there was a gene there, and they, are very isolated, and there's
Well, incestual.
Right. Well, I don't know. I mean, I don't know that it's incestual, but it's small. So another thing that happens to us is natural selection, and probably one of the most familiar examples are Darwin's finches. So as he was going around from island to island in the Galapagos, he saw all these different kinds of birds. They all had different kinds of beaks. And what it turned out to be was those beaks were adapted to whatever food was around. So like this guy has a beak that can eat fruit, and this guy has a beak that eats insects. And, when the genetics of that got worked out, what it was seen was in these populations that were, again, very isolated, one set of characteristics would become predominant over another, right? Because it was more useful. Similar situation in humans, which is very recent. So a lot of people think that humans, aren't evolving, but we are. And a great example of that is lactose tolerance. So in that map there, which shows across the world, the very lightest regions are where most people are lactose tolerant. And the very dark regions are places where people are lactose intolerant. So what happened was, as in Europe, humans began to raise cows and drink milk as a primary source, those genes took off, but they took off very quickly. A lot of European migration into North America, into Australia, but not so much in Africa and South America and Asia. So there must have been, in addition to it being a good food source, because people all around the world drink milk. So there has to be something that's peculiar about North America and Europe and Australia that made that gene so prevalent. And one of the things that, or one of the theories people have, is that it was a combination of milk and milk providing a specific nutrition during times of big pandemics. Right, so when there were cholera or bubonic plague or things like that, milk became, in those populations experiencing those particular plagues, a food source that became very valuable, and so the gene was given an advantage. So we do still see these kinds of things happening today. And you guys can stop me if you want to ask a question anytime.
Well, a lot of the Asian food, you don't really have the milk like we have here in America, France, certain places.
It's true. Not everybody drinks the amount of milk that we do. That's for sure.
Or dairy, right?
Or dairy products in general, right?
information that we do here.
Right.
Renee, I have a question. I know this is species specific probably, but how many generations does it take to develop an adaptive response?
That really depends on so many characteristics. So just if we go back to the lactose intolerance, so that has been 5,000 years from when it first appeared in like European populations to where it is now in North America. So it was a really that's considered a rapid adaptation, 5,000 years. So another thing that happens is what we call genetic drift, and that's where you have a population and something catastrophic happens, like a pandemic, and then people are selected, and it can be really one example I thought of with the COVID pandemic was it's really hard to know what is being selected in some cases, right? Like COVID, I think we're going to be studying that for years and years to understand it. While we are able to, almost immediately say there are people who have certain comorbidities like cardiovascular disease, underlying respiratory disease, underlying kidney disease, who, died at a higher frequency than people who didn't have those things. There have been cases where, super healthy people have been struck down and nobody can explain it. So there also must be some kind of a genetic component to it as well. But again, these are, it's not only things like plagues, it could be war or man-made created things that cut down populations. So any kind of stress on a population can really have an impact. And then finally, in that human migration, one thing that has really happened is a lot of gene flow, a lot of populations exchanging genes. So all of those factors kind of tend to make things more similar, all that kind of selection. So that's kind of how we end up being a lot more alike each other than different, right? So you have to think of that, 3 billion nucleotides that we have and all the genes that expresses. Everything comes in an array, right? Like our skin color, our hair texture, our hair color, our eyes. There's so many different ways that we express those things. It's kind of almost infinite. So you have to, really think about spectrum, right? That's how genes exist. They exist on this big wheel, and you spin the wheel and you see what you get.
Renee, is there any discussion, and this might be just bonkers, so just tell me to kind of hit the hay if so. But are there periods of kind of genetic where diversity flourishes, and then periods where there's almost a culling, where diverse, because the way you're talking about it, so like plagues come, folks are selected out, and certain populations, they have some kind of capacity to survive. And so that must narrow the diversity in the population. And then the plague goes away, the population, the natural state is to become kind of more diverse. And then there's another come in and
so our genes are changing all the time, right? So every time you reproduce, every time your cells reproduce, there's a chance for a change. So that's kind of an inherent thing in us. We're always changing, right? We don't see it because you have to hit in a certain spot for it to really be impactful, or you have to hit in a certain spot, and then there has to be something that favors it if you want to see it go. So there's a lot of change that just does nothing. But one of the reasons we're so successful, and one of the reasons the carbon-based life that we are successful, is because we have that ability to change.
The environment has a lot to do with the physical change.
It can.
And yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, if you are in a northern beginning, and the difference between skin color,
right,
and it's different from anyone who's equatorial. But to me, is what the power group does to decide what is attractive. And that's the culture.
Yeah,
It tells you, so
yeah,
you get into a place where the color of the hair or the color of the skin or the features are, that's the predominant, where everybody wants to be like that. So we start altering our physicality
yeah.
to
that's
be in with
really-
the in crowd.
That's sexual selection, isn't it? Where like,
Yeah,
Yeah,
where
that's a
like,
really,
you know, an animal might develop qualities that are seen as attractive, and that's
like
how you end up
bird
with
plumage.
peacock.
Yeah, right.
Or
Peacock's the
like,
famous one.
yes, or like a deer with unwieldy like antlers,
Mhm.
because that's what the females consider attractive.
Yep, really interesting stuff. That's a whole nother talk.
and us humans, the things that we have in common,
Mhm.
the larger brain, skull cavity, the larger brain, the opposite thumb for grabbing. Look at any of the others, they don't have that thumb,
Right.
right? For grabbing, your heel to stand erect, the backbone. All those we have in common. No matter, so it's all the other accoutrements that are used for power.
Right. So our, you know, the percent of our genome is that 0.1% within that is a very small percent of the change that makes us look
Yeah.
different. The rest of the basic stuff is all the same.
Everybody.
Yeah, right. I know. I mean, I can think like, you know, again, as a scientist, I can remember having arguments with people who used to think that physically black and white people were different. Like,
Yeah.
you know, like somebody had this extra muscle here and that made them better at this. And you're just like, that's culture. Yeah, so like, so the idea is that people perpetuate is kind of a little crazy. So, you know, that, you know, what can that 0.1% tell us about our ancestors? Because there is a lot of information there and we can use it. You know, there are known diseases that can be easily traced, you know, from population to population. And in our ancestry, a very famous one are actually, you know, not only Tay-Sachs, but there's a set of mutations that has been, you know, very predominant in the Ashkenazi Jew population. But also what I picked Tay-Sachs because it's really interesting. So there's the Ashkenazi Jews, but there's also groups that derive from a certain French Canadian heritage. So there's a group in French Canada, there's a group that then, you know, went down to Louisiana and you find the same kind of thing there. So, you know, and then in the Amish country. So Tay-Sachs in, you know, we can find it in ancestral populations, but look how varied the populations, you know, can be.
So don't have children in your zip code.
And, you know, but that is a pretty straightforward, it's a mutation and we understand how it works. Things can be a lot more complicated.
So let me ask you, so with the Tay-Sachs, like I was tested for it, when I was pregnant with my first one. So you have other populations like Amish and the French Canadian. Do they test in those different populations?
Yes, they do. So if you come from a certain population, then you, I mean, this is, you know, I don't know how many people here have been pregnant, but yeah, there's all these kind of medical guidelines that say if you're of this kind of background, you know, you should be screened for the following diseases. Yeah. So absolutely, people do get screened for this. There are some things, you know, some genetic disorders that every human is screened for by state. I should say that. So New York has a very thorough, you know, screening program for newborns. And they do that because most of those things are easily treated, you know, if you know. So as Lovely said, you know, it's a little bit more complicated. It's not only what's encoded in our genes, but it's how they're impacted by the environment. So, you know, your environment, especially health related, you know, the choices you make and your genes, you know, what's in your genes, that all works together. And I think probably one of the best ways to look at this is through twin studies. So this is a graph here from a study in Michigan that had, you know, several hundred twins in it. And the graph looked at a couple of different traits, some diseases, some things like height. And it looked at fraternal twins who do not have the same identical genetic makeup, and identical twins who do. So identical twins are shown in the white boxes, fraternal twins in the light gray boxes. And then on the graph at the top are genetic, where genetic has more of an influence, and the bottom where environment has more of an influence. So you can see right there at the top, height is very genetic controlled, but even in identical twins, you don't have 100%. So, you know, there's something more there. And then you can, you know, as you go down, some of these things that we talk about, like hypertension, diabetes, breast cancer, they're not, you know, they're very environmentally focused. So, you know, just genes is not, you know, 100% of what we experience when we express our genes.
The bipolar disorder is particularly fascinating because the disparity between, you know, the twin and the, you know, identical and fraternal there seems to indicate, I'm not sure what, but like a lot of genetic predisposition. If you've got that big a difference between like how it manifests in identical twins and how it manifests in fraternal twins or just siblings.
Yeah, and your environment cannot, you know, can be chemical, it can be what, you know, what you eat, what you're chemically exposed to. I mean, there's a lot of different environmental factors that can impact that.
So now the multiple sclerosis, so is that, they're looking at the genes that it's through that?
No, they're looking at the condition, the expression, right? So they're saying in, if I'm looking at a fraternal twin, a set of fraternal twins, a set of identical twins, and the percent of that they express that trait, right? So, yeah, so, well, the white box is the identical, right? So you see a higher percentage in the identical than you do in the fraternal, which makes sense, right? But it doesn't take, you know, but not everybody who has the ability to express that trait. If you look at hypertension, so, which is about 50% for identical twins. So even though all of them have that gene, right, only 50% of them express it. So.
These are traits.
So a trait is something that you see on the outside or, you know, can measure, and your genes are what's inside. Yeah. But we know in the case of twins, identical twins have an identical genetic content, right? And then, you know, there are many of our physical traits that are not controlled by a single gene, but are, you know, controlled by multiple genes. And that kind of gets to this expression of an array, right? So we see a lot of things in biology. There's just like this big spectrum, and that's produced, you know, because you can get many mutations within a gene, then you can have multiple genes controlling a physical trait. So it's really, you know, can be very complicated. And we're learning more as we go along. You know, we used to think one gene, one disease, and now we know that that's totally not true. And I think one of the most really interesting areas is sex and genetics, right? So for a long time, the story was you're either male or female, and that's that. But now I think we're learning that that too is expressed in a spectrum. So there's a great documentary on the BBC channel, if you go on for free, called Me, My, Sex, and I. And it's just fascinating. And it describes on this spectrum, I didn't really realize this, that there are, you know, individuals who have sex chromosomes XY, which is a typical male, but they are female. You know, and you wouldn't be able, you would look at this person and you would say, that's a female. And the opposite is true too. And that's because now that we understand how sex chromosomes work and how they work in conjunction with other pieces of our, you know, genome, there's this array. And it happens, you know, when you look totally at these individuals who they call intersexed, that happens at the frequency of the same frequency as a redhead. So it's quite, you know, it's just that we don't talk about it. So it's really, really fascinating.
You about having both,
Hmm?
intersex, but having both, I remember.
No, intersex doesn't mean both.
Right,
It means that you're somewhere in the middle, right? So in the case of this one person in that documentary, she has XY chromosomes. She physically appears as a female, but she doesn't have a uterus. And she has testes, but they were internalized. So they weren't discernible when she was born.
Does it also have to be cognized?
So if they don't develop, right, so it's really fascinating.
these called hermaphrodites.
Well, so
No, so,
I just like the balloon term for,
yeah, but that's not a term used anymore because it
I
was,
know,
it
we
was,
used
used-
to.
yeah.
because it was
Yeah,
used
so
incorrectly.
when
So it's
babies
not,
are born, they don't test their chromosomes usually, they just kind of
Right,
eyeball
they
it.
just say,
Yeah.
oh.
Well, what they have,
well, they do a
It's
couple of
both.
things. They
Yeah.
do, there's the physical description, right? And
Yeah.
then there is, there are tests that will tell you different hormone levels, and those hormone levels usually are what cause tissue to be developed in a certain pattern, right? So does everybody here know that every fetus starts as a female?
Mhm.
And then I always say something goes wrong, but. But yeah, and
But
so,
sex is like race in a way, like more like a social construct with all.
well, gender is a
these different-
social construct,
yeah.
I think. Sex is, we're trying to figure that out, because there is a genetic basis, but it's just not as, by,
There aren't as many.
right,
people
modal
think
as we
that
thought.
Many people think there are huge differences between, women and men, and there really aren't. Right?
Yeah, there are some differences,
Right,
but they're not as
but
vast
on
as
a
you might imagine.
biological level, if you examine the penis and vagina, they pretty much.
Well, they come
mirror
from
each
the
other.
same place, right?
So,
That's the same
mhm.
tissue, and it's just guided by hormones,
Right.
right?
When you were talking about clinical trials, this part between men and women, there's been a whole thing about women are underrepresented and blah, blah, blah. But if they're so genetically close, what difference does it make?
So there are differences, though. So they're not, like a man doesn't have a uterus. So there are those differences, and depending on what you're doing a clinical trial on.
Well, or for a heart attack, have different different
It
symptoms.
does show us
and,
different symptoms.
Right.
Yeah, and there
why
are
would that
really.
be if-
So there are definitely physical differences between males and females. There are definitely different hormonal levels. So it's not, I think, a far stretch to think that things could present differently in men and women.
Okay, so they shouldn't be doing clinical trials based on race, which we know doesn't really exist, but they should be doing different from.
No, I think where we are is we have to make sure we get as much diversity in clinical trials as possible, because we don't know everything yet. I think that's the message you want to send. Not that it doesn't make a difference, but that we don't really understand it all yet, right? But we know that race is not something I couldn't tell you what that is. I can tell you there are sex chromosomes and that they can be expressed in a variety of ways, but I can't tell you genetically what race means. I can't say, well, if you have this on chromosome 3 and this on chromosome 5, then you're, white. I can't tell you that.
So Renee, if I'm getting this correct, there are sex chromosomes, X and a Y,
Mhm.
and an extra shot of testosterone or extra shot of estrogen at a very specific point in time
That's right.
will cause my chromosomes to express differently.
Yes.
That's right.
So I might be a little more this or a little less that,
Right. That's right.
but the chromosomes are, unless there's some kind of change, they are what they are.
Right.
Okay.
So, the old library adage applies here. So what about ancestry tests? What can they tell us? And I think this is, this is an industry that's just been booming, and it is kind of fun, has anybody here sent their stuff away?
Before we found out about the horrific privacy violations.
Oh, well,
Well.
let me tell you, everybody knows your stuff, right? A couple of years ago, I went to Iceland, and this shows you how different cultures have different views of things in general and privacy. So in Ireland, everybody knows everybody's genetic background. They all got themselves sequenced, they understand, and they have all that information. It's just that they feel like that was something they wanted to know. So it's funny, and in the United States, actually, we're kind of loose here, you know,
Is
like legally
Iceland-
with our privacy and,
Yeah.
genetic information, where Europe has gone
Doesn't
seriously.
Iceland specifically have a dating app in order to ensure that people don't date too closely to their own family tree?
I have heard
Because of
something
a
like that.
limited population or
Yes,
something like
yeah.
that? Yeah, so that's probably part of the reason that they all got
Well-
sequenced.
Well, this was a long time ago. I
Um,
didn't think they were thinking about it, you know, whenever app was there, but one of the things that was fascinating that came out of them doing that is, you know, the story we were all told is that, you know, Iceland was populated from the Nordic countries, so Sweden, Norway, Finland. But what they found was like 60% of their genes were derived from Ireland. And what happened was the Vikings, who did come from those places, would scoop up some Irish ladies and take them to Iceland, and that's what happened. But they didn't, you know, that part was kind of lost a little bit to history. So,
And the ladies took charge.
and the ladies, right,
Vikings,
they apparently they
women,
had good
women.
genes. So they
Viking
became
society, the
they
women
became-
ruled.
they became prevalent. So what happens when you get these tests? You know, you spit in a tube, and what the companies do is they look at these specific places in our genome that are called single nucleotide polymorphisms. And all that means is your DNA sequence, which is composed of 4 bases, at certain points, there are, you know, places that are high frequency where we show a lot of changes. And those changes can be put into a pattern that says, okay, most people from, you know, Philadelphia have this gene, or most people from France have, you know, it's very high in that population. So what they can do is they'll do your sequence of these specific regions, find out what change you have, and then they compare it to a database of changes they've built from around the world and see what pattern that you can, that you're closest to. So they advertise this as, you know, your ethnicity, but it's not your ethnicity. It's just what you happen to match closest to. So a great example, I picked this up from, I think it was an article on 23andMe, that company who does that. So if you have a 30%, you know, of your on your profile that, you know, is related to a certain region in Japan, all that means is they're saying there's 30% confidence that these markers we looked at are similar to ones that you would find in that region of Japan. So it's not saying you're Japanese or you're 30% Japanese. It's just saying that you have a probability, you know, to share this set of markers, this pattern with people. And it does though, enable us to tell something about our most recent ancestry, right? Because you know, based on our migration, about how humans started in Africa, right? I always like to tell everybody too, if you go all the way back, we're all African. So now that we're, you know, out and about, these tests are good at telling us what's our closest, you know, or our most recent ancestry.
Renee, it
Uh-huh.
has, so the intense migration of people kind of in the last, I don't know what, let's say 300 or 400 years, that's a relatively like new, some ways new phenomenon. People still were migrating,
Mhm.
but migration happened over, you know, 100 years, not in a single generation. Is this methodology, like in a couple of generations, kind of worthless, given how much people are moving around?
I don't know that it's worthless, but you've probably seen this if you, depending on when you did your ancestry, is they update the databases, and then all of a sudden something new pops and you're like, what? So, yeah, so they update it and then they, you know, give you more accurate information. So sometimes too, you know, because you don't inherit things necessarily evenly from your parents, even though, you know, we're told it's 50-50, it's not exactly 50-50. And then every time, you know, two people have a child, that's a different mix. So you can have siblings that have different ancestry profiles, because that one sibling got the Italian gene and this one got the Japanese gene, or whatever the combination was. So you can have, you know, I've had a lot of friends come and say, well, why is mine, you know, my brother shows this and I don't have that. And that's because you just didn't get that set of markers. So again, I think it's complicated, right? So we're back to, race and ethnicity. These are things that we made up, like we make up a lot of groupings for humans, right? Yankees and, Mets, that's a group. So some interesting studies have been done too on why we do that, or at least what's the outcome of it. And there was this one fascinating study from 23andMe and Northwestern University where they showed, that for the most part, Americans, they know that racial identity is not truly biological, but that the people who do have that belief, it tends to be stronger in the people that benefit from having a certain racial profile. So, right, yeah. Whereas, so white people tend to believe it more because they've had the advantage versus people of color who not. So I thought that was a really, really interesting study. And there's a ton of really good studies out there that just show how unreliable, self-identification is and ethnicity and how complex it is. So I put one or two of the studies here. And also that there are, again, that's really specific to the culture and it can be very fluid, right? So somebody who considers somebody white in one culture might consider them Black in another and vice versa. So there are unfortunately, I'm sure, we could all name a few. There are a couple instances of where humans have used this to gain power against each other, right? So one of the big questions in biology is really like, why do we do this? Why do we group into groups? So of course, the two things that I can immediately think of are, one in the United States, it was used as a justification for slavery. And it was something that at the time, even a lot of scientists supported. And the same thing happened again in Nazi Germany, which is even closer, right? And again, there was a scientific community there who, were putting together articles that weren't true, but, came with some authority that there was, evidence for an inferior race. And it was just, and certainly a horrible time. So we have done very bad things to each other with this need to group. So this remains an enigma, right? There's lots of scientists, social scientists, as well as, biologists who study, why do we cooperate and why do we compete? But this is still, we really don't understand why. How? Well, power, and then, but to cooperate too, there's a lot of advantages for that, right? As a matter of fact, I don't think humanity would have gotten to where we are if we hadn't, right? If we hadn't. So there's a lot of work now, to try to understand why we do that. And when I think of, I wanted to end with, when I think of one of the most interesting lines that scientists are looking at now is they're trying to understand how we compare to organisms that are what's called eusocial. So the Latin origin of that word is just good social. So these are organisms, mostly insects, which are really successful on the planet that have characteristics that are very cooperative, right? Where there's a lot of overlapping generations within a family. There's usually a group within the population that gives up its ability to reproduce in order to help the better good of the group, right? So like in an ant colony or a bee colony, there's a queen, and everybody else, all the worker bees are like, okay, we're not going to do anything. You have all the babies. We're just going to, make everything good for all the babies. And there's even one mammal that's truly eusocial. This is this lovely little organism down there called the naked mole rat.
Oh, yes.
And he kind of lives in burrows that look a lot like ant burrows. But what happens there is they have one female who tends to do all the reproducing, and everybody else they can reproduce in that case. Bees and ants have evolved, so those worker bees actually lose their biological ability to reproduce. But in the naked mole rat, they can still reproduce, they just choose not to benefit, so that all their forces can be put on nurturing the young. So there's a big controversy right now in science about, humans aren't considered truly eusocial, although we have a lot of characteristics like eusocial animals. So there was a scientist who I happen to be quite fond of called Edward O. Wilson, who just passed away.
I love him.
Of this. He is an entomologist by degree, and he studied ants his whole life. I have this like 300-page book on ants.
Yep.
Um,
I've had it since I was 5.
So,
Mhm.
one of the things he posits in this book called The Social Conquest of Earth, which is a really interesting read, is perhaps, these things that started out, when we were in Africa and there's just a couple of us and we had to fight for the few resources there were, we started to group ourselves and to compete for resources. But then we also realized that, there was a lot of safety in that group and a lot of cooperation. So he's suggesting that we might, have some of these eusocial aspects. And he asks the question if, all of this grouping to compete, is that really going to be what undoes us? And should we kind of recognize what we know now biologically and that we're really not that different and stop grouping ourselves? So I thought that was a really, great message and something worth thinking about. And I'll just throw this out there too. So one of the things, again, another thing that remains unknown in biology is why humans have menopause. Do you know there's only 2 species of animals in the world that have menopause?
What's the other one?
Yeah.
Whales.
Oh, yeah.
Whales and humans. Both, whales live in social communities for their entire lives.
Yeah.
Can we evolve past periods?
So, well, you do. Well, at a certain age.
To never get it.
But again, one of the, so scientists think a lot about like, why do you want a bunch of old women who can't reproduce? Because every other mammal just reproduces till they die.
Take care of the grandchildren.
That's the advantage. So that's one of the things, but it's very hard to find the actual, justification for that, but that's another question. So everything, for a lot of genetics, right? Every story we're told is everything is about sex and reproducing, and that's it, right? But as we're finding out, there are these other, people in our population, people who are, post-menopause, people who are intersex, who don't reproduce, yet they're still here. So I think that's something to think about.
Well, something I wonder about all the time is people do horrible things to each other in war, they torture each other, they're this, that, and the other. But as soon as there's a natural disaster, everybody rushes in to help. The same people that they were, your enemies. So why is that? For the survival of the race that's important? Not the race, I'm sorry, the survival of the species, or
Try the Confederacy.
I don't know.
Kind of related, I'm wondering if there's an evolutionary advantage to menopause and having non-reproducing members of the species, does that mean there's also an evolutionary advantage to homosexuality and having non-reproducing members of the
That's
species?
also that people are looking at, right?
Doing studies that they, same-sex couples make better parents and.
Yeah, that's also a question people are looking at.
I mean, that could just be because same-sex parents are sort of naturally selecting for the ones who most want to be parents, unlike heterosexual parents.
There are no accidents. So.
Yeah, so
Every
they're,
child is chosen.
I mean, humans have a very long developmental span, right? It takes us a long time. Sometimes it doesn't even happen, that we get to mature adulthood, whatever that means. So, a lot of the scientific thinking around it is we just need a lot of support. And so there are lots of ways that, biologically you can get support for a community.
As someone who's very senior, but an educator, if before, I know I can't get it done, just keep putting it out there. I don't think that any student in our nation or in the world should graduate from high school without a course in cultural anthropology and physical anthropology. We don't do that. We have biology, which is kind of scientific, something not really related. I don't think I'm putting that out there.
You don't think?
I don't think any high school graduate in the United States should graduate without two mandatory courses, cultural anthropology and physical
They
anthropology.
And I'll
don't
put
teach
civics
anthropology.
on there.
Yeah, civics.
Yeah.
They don't
What's
teach
that?
Civics.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we thought of that, right?
That used to be, and now no more.
I know.
Yeah, but the end of it is that
They don't
we have-
teach it.
Don't have this.
we are grossly ignorant in this whole area.
So Renee, if I were to kind of take
And it
the key
contributes to
takeaways
the-
from your presentation, is that the complexity of genetics and how genes are expressed is unbelievable. It's kind of on a scale we can't even understand. And what we actually know is very, very small in
Yes.
in comparison. And that we have to have that kind of humility
Yep.
as we go out into the world, that what we know is small and the world is far more complex than we could even imagine.
It's a really great way to put it. So that's it. So thank you so much. Thanks for.